What is up, Asymmetry? How you guys doing? I had the pleasure to sit down with Aarin Packard, the curator of the Pacific Bonsai Museum up outside of Seattle in Federal Way, Washington. And Aaron had proposed a few months ago an interview with me for a project he's working on in conjunction with the upcoming World Cup. And to the best of my knowledge, the project is kind of surrounding the exploration of cultural themes that present themselves in the form of bonsai and discussing with a number of global bonsai superstars their impression of how culture is reflected through their trees and whether or not those aesthetics unveil themselves unintentionally in the work that we do. Beyond my own opinions of the subject, I was super excited to just hear some tasty morsels of the thoughts from these different practitioners that Aaron has spoken with already. And it turned into a grand old conversation that I really, really enjoyed. I'm excited to see what Aaron is up to. Take a look at the links in the description down below to check out previous exhibitions that he's done at the Pacific Bonsai Museum, as well as the museum's happenings and how you can get involved. Anyways, for the time being, I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy. Aarin Packard, everybody. Definitely taking that jet stream head on, right on the edge of
Yeah.
the landmass. That was really, really powerful, man. I've spent time on the coast for sure, um, but that was a different experience than I've had on the coast before.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like John Muir describing, he climbing up in a pine tree to experience what a thunderstorm was like in Yosemite, kind of out there, uh, out there in the environment, in the elements. So
Yeah.
it looked like fun. Yeah. We've been out on the coast too a few times where there's been we normally would go on the Oregon coast for around Christmas. And so you get some pretty good winter storms. You don't fully appreciate how rough the coast is in the Northwest until you go out there in the wintertime storm, and it's like it's real. It's a real, it's pretty hairy out there. It's
Y-
not like Southern California where it's like sunny and you can be surfing and whatever. It's like no, there's like, trees are like matchsticks, but they're like 100-foot Doug firs are just stacked up like Lincoln logs, and you're like, there's some power out there for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I have come to the conclusion. I was just in Arizona visiting my parents this weekend with Taft, and I was
Mm,
just telling my parents I've come to the conclusion that the Pacific Northwest is the most rugged environment to actually exist in the United
mm,
States because like the Rockies, you'd get like these blizzards, but it's the sunniest state in the nation, like the most uninterrupted
mm,
sun of any state in continental North America. So like Colorado was, there's those rugged moments, but there's also just so much like really beautiful, sort of passive. Yeah, you can die of
mm,
exposure and all these things, but it's not the same as being soaking wet, incredible
mm,
wind, and the onset, that contact point of storms is just like
mm.
whoa, it's so powerful. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Well, I mean, we're
given.
getting we're getting so much rain right now. I mean, we've kind of been pretty dry for the last few years, but with these latest storms, these atmospheric rivers, I don't know how much rain you guys have been getting, but
Not
water
like
is
you,
a
not like you guys.
major force here, and you forget like, oh yeah, these rivers, they kind of don't stay all, they don't stay within their banks all the time. And so when you get, I think out in like the Olympics, they got like 16 inches of rain in like a few days, like a foot of rain
Yeah,
dropped in 3 days.
that's a
That's
lot of moisture,
intense.
man. That's a lot of more. We got 2 inches in a day here, and I was like, wow, that's a lot of moisture.
Yeah. And there's supposed to be another one on the way. So it's like just as the people are starting to bail things out, here comes another one. So yeah, it seems pretty intense for that amount of moisture. But yeah, the coastline is it's cold, it's rocky, it's rip curls, rip tides, and
Yeah.
who knows what else. But anyway, it looked like you guys had fun
Yeah, we had
out
a good
there.
time.
So
Yeah, Thanksgiving was
cool.
good. You guys have a good Thanksgiving?
Yeah, it was pretty quiet. It was just quiet. We're going to California for Christmas this year, so that'll be a little bit nicer beach experience.
Yeah.
Going down to Newport Beach or something like that. I can handle that.
Yeah. Yeah. Phoenix
So
was pretty nice this weekend.
yeah, yeah.
It's like sunny,
Um,
70 degrees. It was dry. Oh, so nice.
sign me up. Yeah, get a little sunshine. So yeah, that sounds exciting. Yeah, hopefully you get some rest, and yeah, one more week of school and work, and just trying to kind of get to the finish line.
Yeah, get to the
It's been a
finish
great,
line.
yeah, it's been a really good year though for everything. We have our winter bonsai solstice event.
Yeah.
We've been doing that now for 11 years. It was kind of like the atmospheric river. We had like an atmospheric river of people. We had like 1,600 people come through the museum in like 3 hours.
Oh my
Like
gosh.
we had more people in the museum at any one point in time for any event we've ever done. Like it was insane. We normally average like 500 or 600 people for
Uh-huh.
this event. We had an extra 1,000 show up.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, it's a good problem, but we were really like kind of just people were just coming in, like they just didn't stop. We were averaging like 100 people every 10 minutes were coming through the gate.
Wow,
It was
congratulations. That's amazing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean it's one of those, good problems to have, but we're like, oh well, we need, and the weather was perfect. We had a great it was like 57 and clear. And having spent everyone had so much, kind of cabin fever, I think, from being inside for the whole week kind of prior. It was kind of the weather window opened up, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a largely weather dependent event. So some years it's pouring rain, some years it's freezing cold. This year was just phenomenal weather, and then kind of a couple other factors. We did a lot of Facebook advertising, which apparently paid off.
Mm-hmm.
Most people were like, "Oh, we saw this on Facebook," and one guy was like, "Oh yeah, my sister in North Carolina sent me information about this event, and I came." I'm like, so that's a pretty interesting
Okay.
reach. If people in North Carolina are like, "Oh yeah, you should go to this thing by you. It looks cool." So
Yeah.
who knows how the algorithms work, but we seemed like we got some little kind of algorithmic snowball effect going where it kind of got some traction. So
Yeah, you guys tapped
who
into it.
knows?
You had wild
Yeah,
success with branched out too. I mean, you guys kind of tapped into the
yeah,
algorithm, and
mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah,
this whole like social media thing is so crazy now because I haven't used Facebook in like, I don't know, decade.
right.
And it's like it's still popping, and now Facebook and Instagram are linked and everything's, it's just like, whoa, it's a little overwhelming for me, honestly. Like
Yeah,
I'm finding myself to be entering the dinosaur era in my 40s, as opposed to my parents are there in like their, late 60s, early 70s. I'm like, oh geez,
mhm.
this doesn't bode well for the future.
Yeah. I mean, TikTok is like the next arena that we have yet to venture into, but I think Catherine, our communications director, who does a fantastic job at everything, she's like kind of setting herself we're all a little hesitant to dip our toe in TikTok, but
Yeah.
um, that's a whole other market that if that's where all the kids are these days is TikTok. Instagram's kind of for you and me, and then Facebook's like our parents. But
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
mhm,
Yeah, that's pretty good
so
demographic breakdown. I would say that's
yeah,
accurate. Yeah, we talked about playing with TikTok, and basically it was like, all right, Ryan, we're gonna have to film you a lot more, and we're gonna have to work a lot harder. And I was just like, God, there's only so many hours in the day. I am still trying to do bonsai. It's like
yeah,
just a lot of effort to keep up with all this stuff.
yeah. It's content creator is one thing, but that's a full-time job.
It's a full time
So
job. Yeah, it's a full time position at any
yeah,
company now. Is content creation. It's just like content it's necessary in unrealistic dosages at this point.
yeah,
So
yeah. So we'll see how 2026 shakes out, but yeah, 2025 has been a really great year.
that's
So
awesome. Good for you guys, man. I'm
yeah,
I'm, I'm
yeah,
happy for you guys.
yeah. So looking towards 2026, kind of the changing gears a little bit about the nature of our conversation. this idea for our next exhibition is, I kind of mentioned it a little bit to you, but you also were kind of wanting to come in as a tabula rasa, so to speak. So the idea behind this is stemming from a lot of conversations that you've had and I've had, and this idea of unique sort of cultural expression reflected in bonsai, kind of as a distinction of the culture it's being practiced in, right? We see Chinese pinjing and Japanese bonsai as kind of the two easiest examples to receive the designs of trees, the aesthetic values, sort of expressing cultural values and cultural aesthetic influences. And the question was, does that exist outside of those two very established bonsai practices, and what that looks like? And so for our upcoming exhibition, playing off the idea of the World Cup that's coming to North America, this idea of how soccer or football, depending on where you're from, kind of also encapsulates national identity. The teams have their own style of play, they have their own formations, they have their own coaching styles that in some way kind of also represents their nation, and also the kind of the culture they're in. And so that kind of springboarded this idea of like almost like a anthropological study of bonsai, looking at countries that, surprisingly enough, the countries that are kind of the most frequently represented in the World Cup tournament also have very well established bonsai practices. So England, Italy, Spain, Germany, the US, Japan, et cetera, et cetera. And so I've been going since May of this year. I've been reaching out to 2 or 3 bonsai professionals from each of these kind of countries and asking them, interviewing them, if they sort of think this exists in their country, or what cultural values that they maybe see influencing bonsai, either aesthetically, or in how your community operates, how shows are run, all these sorts of things that you maybe would think about. And so it's been really fascinating to hear that. And so I don't know much about European bonsai, but I feel like I have a much better understanding of like how Europe operates. And so for you, obviously you're here for the American perspective, and I know that's something you spent a lot of time thinking about. So kind of just diving into some questions to kind of tease out this idea of how American culture is visible or not, and what ingredients go into that. Is it time? Is it number of practitioners? Like, why do we see what we see, or why do we not see what is not there? So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell the big idea there is giving people, when they come, hopefully we'll have a lot of international guests visiting the museum, they might actually understand bonsai a little bit differently, of like, oh, it's practiced in my country, and this is kind of how it's practiced, or something like that.
Yeah, sure. All right, well, I'm at your disposal.
All right, cool. Yeah, so I think a lot of people can find your kind of origin story, but I am, just for consistency, if you could just kind of give a brief breakdown of, a flyover of how you got into bonsai and kind of how you got to where you're at today.
Yeah, bonsai was more or less like a immaculate conception for me. I mean, I was into the Karate Kid for the martial art aspect of things, but was like made aware of bonsai via Karate Kid. And then I was at a local county fair when I was 12, and I saw bonsai being vended to common individuals. I thought it was kind of isolated to, Mr. Miyagi type figure, like a kung fu, karate, martial arts master, or this like meditative monk kind of iconic figure depicted in American culture, representative of Japanese. And then all of a sudden, like, normal people are buying bonsai trees from this guy that's selling them out of a booth at our county fair, Strawberry Days. And so I didn't actually buy my first bonsai there. I rode my bike to the library like at that moment and checked out every book they had on bonsai, and I was just like all in. And then I saw an article in Bonsai Today like a month after that a family friend gave me with Mr. Kimura's work, and I knew when I checked out those books and started diving into them, like my fascination and like just the general feeling of complete captivation, I was going to do bonsai for the rest of my life. But when I saw Mr. Kimura's work, I was like, I'm going to study with him. I want to do it like that, or some iteration of that. The technique, the artistry, the brilliance of the transformation, the anthropomorphization of the tree. I really felt like he gave it a spirit. And so I just kind of set my track to get to Japan to study with Mr. Kimura. And when I graduated high school, my parents were like, going to Japan out of high school is not really something that we can support. You need a college education. So I went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and majored in environmental horticultural science, which put me right in between the Southern California bonsai movement and the Northern California bonsai movement at a really critical time to see the end of John Naka's tenure. I got to meet John at his last Nampukai show, um, as well as see the rise of Kathy Shaner, the return of Boone, and his teaching principles and techniques being an elevating factor in Northern California, and to be part of the GSBF events at that time, where Mitsuya came in 2000 in Sacramento and curated the exhibition, as well as did like a 4-tree demonstration with all of his pupils on stage: Kathy, Cheryl Manning, Dennis Makashima, Gordon Deeg, and Boone was wiring a tree on stage as well. And so like seeing all of these people doing it at this high level with this Japanese master and stuff, it just continued to kind of reinforce the path that I was already on. So then I ended up going to Japan. The process of obtaining my apprenticeship is pretty well documented with the letter writing campaign and whatnot. But I started my apprenticeship a month after I graduated college in 2004 and ended up finishing in 2010 after the kokufu and sort of the spring season of repotting. And then came back and bought a dilapidated property in the outskirts, or located outside of Portland, Oregon, and I started a building process that is now 15 years and continuing to march forward. In April, we'll hit the 16th year, so it's been a journey, to say the least.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm really interested. This is one, going kind of back to your education, your apprenticeship in Japan. This has kind of been one big schism, at least even outside of culture, individual culture, but even just culture between an Eastern and Western approach to how education exists. And so, in Japan, the traditional approach is emphasizing like learning by observation, through repetition, and just sort of learning by doing rather than verbally explaining, like in the West, how we teach. So even just that distinction and how bonsai is communicated between those two larger Eastern Western philosophies, so do you see this sort of differences cultural, or how has that shaped your own kind of teaching and learning bonsai practice?
Yeah, I think the teaching is definitively cultural. I mean, anytime you have the apprenticeship model as a longstanding mechanism of obtaining skills and abilities and knowledge, I think you have a longer standing culture that is inherently quieter in their demands and expectations, a lot more humble in their learning style, and a lot more willing, wanting, and well versed at observational learning. And so when I started my apprenticeship, I couldn't speak the language, even though I'd studied Japanese in college. I could read and write better than I could speak the language. And so understanding what was being said, the limited amount that was being said, and being able to communicate myself were just not possible. And it took, there's at like the 2-year mark, I remember thinking, oh, I can understand everything that's being said and I can say what I want to say. That was kind of like a critical point where I did shift from just strictly observational learning to being able to pick up a lot more. And that definitely increased the rapidity with which I understood things. But nevertheless, there wasn't a lot of like direct, like, this is how you do it. Now, Mr. Kimura was unique in the fact that he needed apprentices to build their abilities quickly to contribute to what he was trying to do, because he had such a massive scope of work at his facility of like 1,200 trees, client trees coming and going constantly. entering a significant number of kokufu trees into the kokufu every year, more than any other professional by a factor of, like 8, 9, 10 times the trees that anybody else was entering. And so it, I also came at a point where Urushibata, the number one, was, 12, 18 months from finishing his apprenticeship, and there was kind of a significant gap in the apprentices. And so I did get a lot more, I would say, explained to me, or at least shown to me, than probably a lot of other apprentices did. But I also was going home every night and working pretty diligently in my apartment, wiring branches to learn how to wire and bringing them back and asking for critique from my senpai or Mr. Kimura on occasion, although that was rare because his time was so valuable. Going back sort of as I progressed in my bonsai, going back to my apartment, styling my own trees, working on the significant techniques that I saw Mr. Kimura perform that day or that week. I would like find a tree on Yahoo auctions and try to find a tree that was cheap, but I could like work on these techniques, transform. And that actually was probably my biggest advancement in my apprenticeship, was going back and performing the techniques that I was seeing performed in my early years as an apprentice, because then I knew what it felt like. I knew how hard it was. I knew where I was stumbling, and next time that technique was performed, I could watch how Mr. Kimura handled that critical moment on a wedge cut, on a hollowing of a live vein, on a bending methodology, and really key into like where I wasn't getting it and see the feel, see the execution. Because when you watch somebody proficient, they make it look easy. And this stuff in bonsai is not easy. I mean, applying structural wire, 4-gauge wire is not easy. There's techniques to make that accessible. Doing a wedge cut that fully closes with no overbite, underbite, everything lined up, getting the kind of quality of movement into the tree at the perspective that you're taking on the tree. That stuff took a lot of, for me in my learning style, a lot of practice to see maybe what was obvious to other people, or maybe not obvious to other people, but to really learn while I was there and still had the ability to go kind of tweak and evolve my understanding of that. And that kind of takes me to where I think the learn by observational model of these longstanding cultures that have based their skill set in apprenticeships maybe have a slight, there's like pros and cons to both, overtly teaching outwardly and explaining and then letting somebody do it and then correcting them and continuing to dialogue about it, versus showing, even if you're not intentionally showing or directly showing, but showing a technique, allowing somebody to observe, to see it multiple times, to try and make sense of it, and then to start to pull in their help to assist with it, and then eventually, as their skill set progresses, to allow them to perform the technique. When you make mistakes in the observational model, Mr. Kimura was very insistent that the harder he came down on us for mistakes, the more that we would remember it. But you also remember like the tactile execution and where you went wrong, and then you watch somebody do it again more proficiently, and it's kind of embedded that those mistakes were not going to be tolerated by the degree of severity of the reaction to the mistake. That allowed and really pushed me to be observing the tree, observing the tissue structure, observing the horticulture before and after. Like, my peripheral vision of bonsai in that experience grew exponentially. And coming back to the United States, where I have nobody teaching me anymore, having that observational learning muscle highly exercised has allowed me to decipher and figure things out that I don't think other people are as well equipped to do necessarily, because they weren't forced to exercise that muscle in the Western world. And so you do have this longer process of learning through the observational model, but I think you have a higher depth of knowledge and understanding of it. And you also develop the ability to self-teach through observation just in general in bonsai, which is like a critical component of the art form. But you can expedite that process through verbal explanation, and you can get people up to a certain level very quickly with verbal explanation. How they're able to evolve and advance with those really nuanced aspects of technique and application does still hinge on whether they can observe and learn on their own beyond that, because you can't give them the feel. They have to obtain that feel. You can't give them the insight of all of the nuances because you can't remember the infinite number of possibilities that go into success or failure in any technique, in any situation, on any species, at any season over the course of time. So there's almost like in the West, a little bit of a ceiling on the verbal explanation that does require the same time investment and observational learning that the Eastern model of apprenticeship or the European model of apprenticeship in some of their traditional trades provides. And I think that is where maybe in the West and in our style of teaching, we have hit a little bit of a ceiling and a little bit of a limitation to being able to continue to progress and achieve that level of mastery, so to speak, that you see in these more long-standing, high level of craft commitment to mastery cultures.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just a quick sidebar. You did hit record right on this. We're recording.
Should be recording. Yeah, but let me just
Awesome.
pause for 1 minute because Brandon's got
Yeah.
music playing downstairs. Let me ask him to shut it down.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay. Okay, thanks for that.
Oh yeah, no worries. Yeah, so that's really interesting. That's one thing that's come across in the European discussions I've had is this appreciation of craftsmanship and partly, and I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole yet, but yeah, that appreciation for craft and the time that is dedicated to perfecting it is definitely something that Europe holds in high regard, and they hold Japan in a higher regard for their even more kind of dedication to pursuing that. And so I'm wondering if, in the US, bonsai information has sort of typically been presented through clubs, workshops, lectures, kind of critiques if you go to a show, rather than these sort of long-term apprentice style, apprenticeships. And so, how do you think this educational structure has influenced the development of American bonsai aesthetics? Like, is there a relationship between the two of them, you think?
Yeah. Yeah, there's like a lot of interesting strands to dissect here, and I think one of the big differences between Europe and Japan, because they do both have an apprenticeship model for learning the traditional trades and crafts and art forms. I mean, you could go all the way back to the master painter studios, right? And the stonemasons and a lot of these like really pivotal central pillars of the artistic aspects and cultural aspects in Europe and Japan have a lot of crossover, but the Japanese model is more about, and this is a cultural component of sacrificing the good or the thought or the demand or the desire of the individual for the betterment of the whole, right? As like a community. And I think that's where you see a humility in Japanese culture that, for example, Mr. Kimura would show me a technique and he would say, "Can you do this?" And in the United States, we're taught to say, yes, I can, right? I can do that. And then you try and you can't do it, but like you get praise for trying it, right? And being confident enough to say I can do it and trying it and realizing you can't and then learning how to do it. But in Japan, you're expected to say no, I can't, but I would like to learn. And that difference of orientation, when you apply that to Europe, Europe is a little bit of a hybrid of Japan and the United States because Europeans have this backbone of learning these traditional trades and crafts, but Europeans will go study with an instructor and have a workshop or a weekend or some sort of very minimal amount of study, and then they'll open up their own bonsai school and start teaching their own students. And so from the bonsai perspective, I think Europe has been impacted by having this fundamental backbone of being able to have these cultural learning models, but also the ego of, I think, the Western world in general, United States for sure. Europe also does suffer from this in the bonsai model. The ego of wanting to be a master, wanting to be a teacher, wanting to be considered in high regard, wanting to have the reputation, wanting the attention, etc. I think has really impacted the European ability to hit that higher level. And so there's always this reverence when you're trying to get to this level and you're seeing Japan achieve it, that the United States and Europe has always been grappling with how do we get there, how do we get there, how do we get there. And the biggest thing that I see with that is this long-term acknowledgement of a pursuit of perfection, the discipline of pursuing it on a daily basis, but then the limitation of the ego getting in the way of not recognizing you're not quite there yet in the West. And that not quite there yet is what keeps you pushing forward, keeps you humble, keeps you moving. Now, inside of that, the Japanese model is really functioning off of what I think post World War II with the Kokufu exhibition, creating the construct of economy and bonsai, a more patternized approach. There's kind of an objective that is understood to make a bonsai, a Japanese term, a tree and tray, but the aesthetic that comes with that of the orthodox or the traditional form means that there is obviously still a tremendous amount of interpretation and creativity that goes into execution of the traditional model, because no two trees are ever going to be the same, but there is an understanding of what is trying to be accomplished that allows for efficiency and allows for like a beginning point of what are we looking for and what are we trying to achieve. And I think in the United States, where we've differed, or at least where some people have differed, is understanding that I'm not trying to achieve that same thing, the bonsai form. I'm not trying to achieve that necessarily. I'm trying to do something different. And now branching away from that singular artist statement to a more unique and diversified individual artist statement. The problem with that is that the quality of the outcome of the product, right? The tree that is made, without the mastery of technique and without the deep understanding of that approach and that singular objective, makes it very difficult to move into this new aesthetic that you're exploring with a high level of technique that allows you to refine it and achieve the same level of mastery over time, because you never had mastery to begin with. So how do we take something that we haven't mastered, that is not culturally familiar to us, that we're kind of mimicking, master that, and then take that mastery and apply it to new forms that are an expression that are unique to ourselves? And I think in Europe, there is maybe a slight lack of understanding of how much their culture is informing their aesthetic, their behavior, their thought process, their perspective. And so you get an attempt to mimic the Japanese model, but you can't take the Italian out of an Italian, and you can't take the Spaniard out of a Spaniard, and you can't take the Brit out of a Brit. And so there's this attempt to do Japanese bonsai, but there's always this cultural tether that's very long and historical in any European culture that does exercise and execute an aesthetic unique to them from the culture that they're trying to pursue this sort of foreign entity and foreign aesthetic with, that because there's not a mastery of that original model where they've learned that outside of the context they're creating in their own country, it's very difficult, I think, to see those cultural executions express themselves in the tree. But nevertheless, if you're well versed in the traditional model and you see the cultural components of these different countries making bonsai, it's very easy aesthetically to see where there are those strands of DNA that tether that piece of work. However accurate the intention to mimic the Japanese model is, it still has DNA of that culture in which it was created, that I find to be really unique and diversify even the traditional model across the globe when it's trying to be emulated and created.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there to touch on. Yeah, I think that's one of the things I've heard from a lot of Europeans, is how high in regard they hold the Japanese aesthetic. And it sounds like now most trees in Europe are, heavily Japanese, like they're referencing to the Japanese form, in that they're their preference is for imported material more so now than maybe ever, is from what I'm sort of understanding, from an economy scale. And while there's Yamadori being collected, it doesn't have the age that you can buy by buying a 30 or 40-year-old, container grown tree from Japan, because that is kind of the highest aesthetic quality that they're seeking. Um, so yeah, that was one thing that kind of jumped out at me, was that, and then also this sort of this inability to sort of see their own cultural reference, because they're sort of pursuing that Japanese ideal so much. It also sort of made anything that deviated from that, there was not really it kind of was met with that, well, the technique is not good, or the quality is not good, or so it was that sort of same thing. It was like, if there's no standard, if it's a different standard than Japan, it's almost like then there's no standard. Like it's like, well, you're just sort of like, it's natural style, so it can look like whatever. Like, it doesn't have to look good. Kind
Yeah,
of was
that's
the
tough, huh?
was the sentiment.
That's tough, and it's unfortunate that the expectation is not that the same level of craft and technique and artistry can be applied to something outside of the Japanese model to actually represent
Mm-hmm.
nature in miniature, which again, like, I've really pushed people hard recently. I've really pushed people hard recently to go back and try to get their hands on pre-World War II texts and pre-World War
Mm-hmm.
II magazines, books, etc. from Japan, because you see the birth of the traditional model, but you see a lot of free form, very, very wild, very, very organic designs, and you see the trees very or relatively young in their development. Even though a lot of these trees have been in pots, or not a lot, like World War II wiped out a lot of trees pre-World War II that were bonsai. But there are trees that existed prior to World War II that still exist. Obviously, a lot of them, fewer and fewer as time progresses. But you know, those trees didn't necessarily have the same rigor of the traditional model applied to them over the course of time. And certainly there were practitioners, there were gardens, there were mentalities that were already doing that prior to World War II. But there also was a lot more diversity of the artist statement of the people practicing bonsai prior to World War II, that gave a lot more differentiation of shape and had a lot of really wild natural forms that were being kept and valued and prized in the bonsai pre-World War II. And so, like, you really do kind of see this evolution of culture in Japan that has been accepted outside of Japan as kind of the model of what we're supposed to do. But there's a much richer history and a much deeper conversation of how that model evolved, why it evolved, where we're at today, how that's been refined and perfected, to the trees that we see in Japan, and potentially even how the pinnacle of it has been touched and maybe crested a little bit. And there's like a preservation, maintenance, and a continuation of that. But any art form that isn't growing, ultimately, I do believe, is dying. If it's not progressing, if it's not continuing to modify its form and shape. And who knows where that will go for Japan in the modern world. But certainly, I think in North America and Europe, there is a desire to continue to push this farther and see what's possible. And I think in the United States specifically, there is a desire to express the individual thought, experience, aesthetic in the material that we have at our fingertips without being able to import the traditional model. We kind of have vestiges of that, but more than anything, we're relying on field grown material, or we're relying on Yamadori to really kind of continue the growth and acceleration of bonsai in North America. And I think that's made us really unique in the fact that we do have a different mentality. The individual is trying to express themselves, and we
Mm-hmm.
have a really wild, rugged landscape that gives us really wild, informal material. And we can try to pull that back into the traditional model, and sometimes that's appropriate. But there's a lot of trees that are never going to be a great traditional bonsai and can be an absolutely impeccable illustration of nature in miniature and in the real tree form of
Mm-hmm.
that species under certain environmental conditions. And that requires observational learning to build your data bank with, and then it requires a mastery of technique to be able to execute it at the highest level so that when you do present it, it's not automatically discounted as, like you just said, natural form, you can kind of do whatever, but it's looked at as a little bit of a redheaded stepchild in bonsai design across, I would say, a majority of the Western world. And that's
Hmm.
unfortunate because it doesn't have to be that way. It's just a matter of perspective of what makes something quality, not abiding by the traditional model necessarily, but the technique and the execution and the time and the age and the maturation of that concept over the course of that bonsai's life is what's going to give that aesthetic the same merit as a traditional aesthetic.
Yeah. Yeah, moving sort of towards the idea of reflecting nature in miniature. The U.S. has such an enormous range of climates, from alpine mountains to temperate rainforests and kind of everywhere in between. So, how do specific environments where you've lived? I know you being from Colorado and now the Pacific Northwest. How have those environments shaped the way you understand trees and their growth habits and how they're used, their expression in bonsai?
Yeah, I think the environments that I've grown up in, so, the Rockies in Colorado, I mean, I was smack dab on the west side of the Rockies, which is where the Utah desert moved into the foothills of the Rockies, which was a really interesting place to grow up because I grew up in a town that was surrounded by old Rocky Mountain junipers, like big, old, impressive, rugged Rocky Mountain, like right out my back door. I was climbing up the hillside, grabbing onto Rocky Mountain junipers, ponderosa pines, lodgepole pines when you got a little bit higher, and so that was just normal to me. I don't think I noticed them as much until I started getting into bonsai, and then I was like, wow, these are amazing and impressive. Look at that twist. Look at that trunk. And going and trying to find Yamadori as a kid when I was 12 and looking at these places, it took me to a lot of places with a lot of wild trees and a lot of really harsh landscapes. And I started recognizing how special the Western United States was. And then when I went to college in California, I collected on the coast, collected a lot of oaks, collected in the like the interior ranges, a lot of California junipers, went to the Mojave with Harry and collected some of those trees there, the scrub oaks, the California junipers, and some of the high desert varieties. But then I spent a lot of time in the Sierras collecting Sierra juniper, ponderosa pine, sugar pine, Jeffrey pine, and just like getting a real diversity of the landscape that started to expand what I knew of as possibilities. And then I think the big thing for me is I didn't go to Japan to try and duplicate the traditional model. I went to Japan to learn Mr. Kimura's cutting edge technique that would allow me to come back and handle our Yamadori and our raw material, which is bigger and bolder and has longer needles and coarser branching structure and everything, but it would allow me to handle it technically. And whatever came of it artistically or aesthetically, I was pretty open to. Now, in my apprenticeship, I was there for 6 years turning out work that was representative of Mr.
Oh,
Kimura's
still there?
style. Yeah, did you lose me?
Yeah, there was a little hiccup there. I think
Oh,
we're
okay.
back.
The audio here is good. So, um,
Okay.
over the course of my apprenticeship, for 6 years, I was turning out trees that were representative of Mr. Kimura's work that were fitting into the traditional model and the Kokufu model specifically. And that was really good to get that kind of repetition and the speed and the understanding and see how that can change with maturation, with species, with different aesthetic concepts. And Mr. Kimura, surrounded himself with imagery of the natural environment and applied that, I think, in subtle ways to the way that he executed design on his trees. He had pictures of the
Yeah.
bristlecone. He had pictures of the Pulian
Hmm.
olives. He had pictures of the Taiwanese junipers in the high mountains. And he's very famous for creating rock plantings of the Yellow Mountains in China and some of those landscapes. So, like, he was pulling that into his work already, but he was creating it inside of a culture in Japan that was still tethered to the orthodox or the traditional model. And his economics, situation hinged on the trees that he created getting into the kokufu, or his clients' trees getting into the kokufu. So there was like a box to some degree around the work. Um, Coming back to the United States and sort of recognizing I could try to do that, but it wouldn't be authentic to try and continue emulating the traditional model on a continuum. What else is possible? And then really digging into the wild environments across North America and building that data bank for real with the technique and the understanding and seeing what I'm looking at and trying to convey that and having the ability to do so kind of piled on what I had already started before my apprenticeship in Japan, wanting to create shapes that were unique to the environments and the material that we were utilizing. But I had such a more educated eye to be looking at it and figuring out where in the design does that get incorporated? What type of material facilitates that kind of aesthetic creation? How does the environment impact that? How do the elements acting on that tree impact that shape? And how do I do that better and better and better, which required being in the wild more and more and more to move in that direction. But I always, I respected Dan Robinson, I respected Walter Paul, I respected Nick Lins for their pioneering innovation. And I felt like they always got the short end of the stick in their work because technically they may not have mastered the technical component and they may not have had the refined knowledge of how to age that over time with the bonsai process, which is where I developed the concept of the vortex just to kind of explain how bonsai maturation occurs in the orthodox model. That is applicable to a natural style. The technique is applicable to a natural style. The restraint that you need to show at a tree's mature stage is applicable to the natural style as well as the traditional style. And so a lot of those pieces of fluency that I got from my apprenticeship and the abundant repetition in that style, applying those to a more wild form, I think just gave me a little bit of a unique skill set to elevate this sort of bastard child natural style to a level that has the same degree of technique and is now in the process of refinement and aging in the bonsai form that maybe has raised people's awareness of the quality that it can acquire over the course of time, and that being equally respected as just a different aesthetic but handled with the same rigorous technique and refinement.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I'm thinking too, also the influence of Colorado, but also the Pacific Northwest where you're at now. The Pacific Northwest has these immense forests and long-lived trees, and the time scales that exist here, you kind of are far going to exceed our human lifetime. And so, how do you, how does working within this landscape dominated by these very large ancient trees affect the way you think about age, proportion, reduction in scale for bonsai?
Yeah. So I saw a drawing back in like 2012 on the internet that showed it was an illustration that showed the maturation of a western red cedar. And it showed like a 50-year-old tree is like this perfect little Christmas tree, and it showed like a 250-year-old tree with like a slight little flaw to the perfect triangle of the coniferous model. And then I saw it was like 500 years, it had multiple reiterations, 800 years, it had no lower branches, 1500 years, it was quite asymmetrical, 3,000 years, it was all reiterations in a completely different looking tree. And in that, the scale and proportion of that material changed. And I really recognized, like, wow, in the orthodox model, I was used to seeing trees, Kicho bonsai, refined to a high level, outgrow their proportion, have some branches removed, have the shape closed down to a proportion that magnified the scale of the trunk again. And that was considered a great redesign. But the actual asymmetry, the actual expression of age was more held in the teenage years of the tree's form as it actually would occur in the natural environment. But you had this value put into the mechanical and the human touch of mochikomi in the branches and age of that tree under artificial environment in the bonsai container. And I started recognizing, like, okay, so can we value that human induced age and time spent under artificial conditions while also elevating the aesthetic age of the tree as it would follow a narrative arc in the native environment? And that really became like a critical component of the vortex and the evolution of development, because I realized when you come full circle around the vortex of one aesthetic iteration in a bonsai, you are now at a point where the canopy's outgrown the proportions and you need to regain the scale and proportion that gave that material value. And I knew how it would be done in Japan, right? We might remove the length out of this branch. We might take this branch here to expose a little bit more depth and open up a slight amount of space, but then we're going to close the canopy down around it and regain the same kind of even distribution and branching density that we had with the initial design. It's just slightly smaller now, and now the trunk looks bigger. And I started thinking, okay, well, what if we get rid of the kaishieta, the balance component, which is a very cultural value system in Japan, right? Where the balance of the tree is accomplished in the foliar canopy and not really leaning on the characteristics of the piece of material. Strong piece of nabari on the left. Do you really need a branch balancing that tree's physical mass on the left as well? Well, no, because you have the nabari to take its place. And in the native environment, 1,500, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 year old tree, you're going to lose the elements in the foliar mass that keep it in that triangular form of youth. And you're going to get a greater and greater degree of asymmetry and more negative space and a lot more deadwood, which in the coniferous model might be overtly obvious. And in the broadleaf model might be hollows in the loss of that physical mass within the tree. And so I started recognizing all of these tools and techniques that allowed bonsai that we were creating here at Mirai to be able to show that narrative arc in the natural environment, and allowed me to be able to evolve these concepts of natural shapes in a direction that would continue to represent that natural form and that natural life cycle and that natural narrative arc of that tree's existence under those specific conditions, coastal, wind, alpine, etc., etc. And I think that is not necessarily something that was new, because I've seen it in pre-World War II trees, and I've seen it in other cultures manifesting age in the design of their bonsai. Indonesia has a really interesting bonsai culture and bonsai style to the way that they accomplish scale and proportion in their branch formation and the rhythm and movement they put into those branches that have tremendous length beyond the traditional model in Japan. But I think I was able to, in the American way that we kind of try to process and teach and digest knowledge, I was able to verbalize it, quantify it, structure it so that it became accessible and it wasn't just a feeling or a unobtainable sort of waft of air passing by me as an artist when I'm working with a student. And I could say, listen, I'm going to increase the degree of asymmetry here. I'm going to leave behind more negative space because the tree's aging, and that negative space is going to be filled with deadwood or the remnants of what used to exist to show that aging process. And I really think those elements of being able to quantify it allowed it to start to be more dialogued about. It became a discussion now because there is words put to this process which are pivotal for the Western world to grab onto that concept and not have it be one artist's sort of ownership of their approach. And that was important to me because in the Western world, to make a living as a bonsai professional, you're an educator to make that living more often than not. In Japan, you're an artist. You're a preservation of time capsules. You are a curator and perpetuation of history as much as anything else. Very few Japanese bonsai professionals are educators. And so there's a difference there that demanded I really clarify what I was trying to accomplish and how I was going to go about that. But ultimately, that led me down the path of scale and proportion is everything for representing natural design. Because if you're trying to create something that conjures the image of a 300 or 400 foot tall redwood, then naturally you have to narrow the width of the branches and increase the height of the tree. And that's a scale and proportion move that takes away a lot of branches that people would historically use for a redwood and say, this is a redwood, but it doesn't give you the sense of scale and proportion on a redwood. And when you think about some of the really big, powerful trees in Japan with these big bloated canopies, it's like there's a value system around the economic value of that foliar mass and that mechanical and artificial maturity that occurs inside of a bonsai container that is very culturally specific and suitable to the kokufu model. But that tree might be able to show a greater amount of age and a more natural reflection if it were handled a little bit differently. Does that mean they should be handled differently? No, not necessarily, because that's a bonsai being created inside of the culture that defined bonsai. But if people are saying, well, isn't the whole goal of bonsai to represent nature in miniature? Maybe that's my goal with bonsai. Maybe that has been expressed as a blanket sort of accepted artist statement of what we're doing with this art form. But that, I don't believe, is the artist statement that Japan is necessarily functioning under. And that's not a black and white issue, because there are a lot of artists in Japan that do make very natural looking trees that are very representative of the environments, and illustrating and executing scale and proportion on a really adept level. So it's sort of like this broad discussion that has a lot of chinks in the armor and a lot of exceptions. And ultimately, everybody who's practicing bonsai does, once they're able to master technique and reduce the limitations of executing their aesthetic preferences and goals, does have the ability to express themselves and their vision. And you're seeing that more and more, I think, as there's a lot of distribution of the imagery of bonsai on a global level, right? Through social media, through the internet, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think here in the U.S. too, we have that history of relationship to Japanese Americans, and the Japanese model is still, well loved here as much as it is maybe, elsewhere. It's not like there's no traditional bonsai being done. I think of Peter T, who's kind of maybe leading that aesthetic movement, continuing that value. And so, the distinction between the Japanese sort of traditional forms that are sort of reflecting those landscapes. How do you think the American bonsai draws more directly from the wilderness and sort of untamed environments? And sort of how does that influence what you're seeing today with bonsai in the US, where we're sort of straddling, those two kind of camps isn't the right word, but those two sort of aesthetic values of the Japanese traditional forms versus these sort of more wild, you know, reflective of the natural environment shapes as well. How do you sort of see that sort of playing out, or influencing what we're seeing today?
Yeah, I think people in the United States are still largely committed to the traditional model and valuing the traditional model. And I think that comes from just, it takes a lot of time to practice the traditional model to a degree where you start asking what else is possible. Because it's a let's just be really clear. The traditional model is beautiful. It's stunning. It's what captured all of our imagination and attention getting into bonsai. And for a lot of people, they're like, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. Like, what is the need to try and do something else? This is awesome. And I largely agree. I think they're not wrong. The problem is the material that we have access to doesn't necessarily lend itself to the traditional model all the time. And then what do you do with that? And so it's almost, for me, it was almost a necessity. Yes, I grew up wanting to create bonsai that represented the native landscapes I'd grown up in, because I grew up in really harsh, rugged landscapes in the western United States and continue to immerse myself in that here in the Pacific Northwest, but also the time I spend in the bristlecone groves, the redwood groves, the sequoia groves, the sierra groves. Like, it just only makes sense to me that certain material can't be a great traditional bonsai, but can be a great representation of a, pillar sentinel limber pine on a rock outcropping that's distributed there by the Clark's nutcracker, and therefore grows in this environment that most pines would never inhabit or occupy based on their seed distribution habit and ecology of the environment. So like those things are, that science and that ecology has triggered a lot of ideas for me of what to do with material that doesn't lend itself to being an awesome version of the traditional model, or let's just go to a much more rudimentary situation. I'm going to buy a nursery stock Hinoki cypress, and I wire all of those branches down into a traditional form with a pinky sized trunk and branches that are as long as the trunk is tall, and a Hinoki doesn't backbud readily. It's never going to be a good orthodox form. So then what do you do with that very seemingly potential-less or potential limited piece of material? You have to alter your approach. And I think that's where the birth of understanding scale and proportion and representation of nature in miniature has made more material not only acceptable, but more material valued at the highest level for good bonsai creation, when we expanded the walls of the box to pull in these other forms that we have an immediate reference to. It's not necessarily manifested like a cosmic bonsai, where we're conceptualizing trees growing on another planet, which is awesome and amazing and just blew my mind when Lorin talked about his concept for cosmic bonsai. It's rooted in the landscapes that we're growing up in or the landscapes that we're immersing ourselves in, and expanding our data bank of what we can do with this phenomenal material and opportunity we have to create something not unique for the sake of creating something unique, but creating something unique for the sake of doing justice to the material. And I really do think the tree needs to lead the dance, which is trying to remove the self from that as much as possible and trying to let the material guide the aesthetic manifestation of an image that connects people to the natural environment. Beyond that, though, I think there's another factor and force that plays into North American bonsai, certainly, and probably insidiously creeps into every other bonsai culture, depending on where it's practiced, and that is urbanization and the urban environment. Because we have these very strict organized systems that we immerse ourselves in and exist in, and these systems in which we create in, where when you start making a bonsai in the built environment in an organized system, it creates a level of organization in the product that you're creating that maybe isn't as natural, which is where Walter Paul would kind of take that and kind of mess up the branches a little bit and say, okay, now we're starting to get somewhere where it actually looks a little less constrained and constricted and controlled and feels a little bit more natural and representative of trees that I see. There is like a organization that goes into this whole thing that I think is a product of the built environment having expanded, the natural environment having shrunk, and that global situation being represented by this art form, which is like a really critical and significant dialogue that I don't think people talk about enough. And so I think that's a third factor. And I think in North America, that's a big one where when you say, oh, go make something natural, people are not in an environment and haven't put themselves in an environment where they necessarily have the data bank and the inspiration or even the passive digestion of stimuli to be able to do that. So it's like asking a lot to be like, hey, Aaron, you're sitting in a concrete workshop framed out with, standard lumber and a normal pitched roof. Hey, man, make something that would exist on a cliff, on Hurricane Ridge in the Olympic National Park. And you're like, yeah, I can kind of imagine something like that, but it's never going to be, it's going to be such an abstraction that there might be just a whiff of that deviation from the traditional model. And I think that's where trees that are created in a different context have opened the door to understand how context really does have an impact on the shape and form that we're creating on a global level, sharing and starting to inoculate the community with, to what degree it grows or evolves or people are able to grab hold of that, I think really depends on what their artist statement is or their desire is in the things that they create. And certainly for me, that's been a big wake-up call that there's more out there and there's a lot deeper level to this art form than maybe I originally perceived.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the questions then is like, are there some that tendency to organize? Like, I almost feel that that's more of a human universal. Like, just human beings are prone. We like to organize our environment. That's like the civilization is a byproduct of organization, right? And so it's fascinating to see, like, while there's a cultural expression and the influence of civilization uh contrasting nature, right? The whole sort of nature nurture sort of division within even anthropological understanding of how people groups have evolved or have become quote unquote civilized over time, right? There is that tendency to do that. So yeah, I'm almost wondering, like, if that's an inevitability. Like, is it just baked into us as human beings? Like, that is we can't help it but organize things. And so I just I don't
Yeah.
know, I don't really have a question to that. I almost want, it's just more of an observation of, like, because where I was going with that is, like, I think part of this idea of culture, and that's one of the questions I was asked, is like, how did I choose which sort of countries to focus on? Because a lot of them are Eurocentric or the Western centric, and as we want to be representative, and but also I don't know what bonsai in Nigeria looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Is there bonsai in Chad, in Africa? I don't know. So, like, bonsai as a We know that as civilizations develop, art emerge. Like the art as a profession, or sort of classical art or whatever. Like you have to sort of hit those basic fundamentals of society, of like safety and clothing and food. Like those things kind of need to be there first. The whole Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and art comes later. So it makes sense that these civilized, quote unquote civilized, developed, there we go, maybe more developed societies have more prevalent bonsai representation. So you kind of have to go where there's bonsai. But yeah, I don't know. Like I wonder what, like if all civilizations move towards that more organized structure, would it make sense that art follows that in some way, bonsai being included?
Um, Maybe. I mean, I think we in North America idolize, if you are a conservationist or you value the native
Hmm.
environment, there's a lot of romantic discussion about the Native Americans and how they interacted with the landscape, how they managed the landmass, how they worked with nature. I think it's probably not necessarily because the nomadic style of life was dominant for however many hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of years. I don't know those anthropological timelines, until organized society kind of began and the farming sedentary culture started. But like, um, when you think about that, that's almost potentially more a product of managing population and numbers as opposed to a trend or a tendency in humanity to be more and more organized, I think. And I think when you see that separation from living with the land to starting to kind of temper the environment and take control of it and use it for, a more organized structure to facilitate societal sustenance, right? So you've got shelter, food, and your basic human necessities, and then art comes later. It's almost like art or expression comes as a way to express the plight of that organization, right? It's like now we're
Hmm.
dialoguing about all of the crap that comes with us no longer having to work inside of nature to sustain ourselves and have that kind of
Hmm.
humility and knowledge of where we stand in the greater environment. And so now all of a sudden we've got politics and religion and gender and economics and sexual preference and race and ethnicity that we're creating art around to talk about how this organization has fucked us all up, basically.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so if the nomadic lifestyle didn't exist and there wasn't a high level of success that was demonstrated in the nomadic lifestyle, I think I would agree with you that we do have a tendency towards organization. And I think our brain, as we've become more populated on planet Earth and achieve this organization to foster sustenance of the population, it has maybe played into our brain's tendency to organize for efficiency, which I think
Hmm.
playing into, I've recognized this and I'm going to take it all the way back to the bonsai approach that we've been talking about. That leads to very efficient creation. When you have an artist statement that you're working off of that's similar to everything else, right? It is efficient. So you can create bonsai on higher quantities practicing the traditional model. When that's what you know your objective is. On a conifer, I'm going to drop these branches, I'm going to form these pads, I'm going to round out this apex. I'm going to do that to every conifer that I approach. Well, what happens to the conifer where you take the branches up instead of down? Where the apex is no longer round, it's triangular and pointed, where no longer there's a balance branch to the defining branch. And all of a sudden, there's not necessarily a fundamental container. Now there's a piece of metal, piece of glass, piece of concrete, piece of wood, piece of rock, and everything suddenly starts to change. Well, now you're not inside of that efficiency pattern anymore, and it takes more time. It takes a lot more
Hmm.
energy and effort because you're challenging your organization, the trained organization, which you and I are born and raised in a time where we don't know a non-organized society, and I think that's
Hmm.
probably universal for a lot of developed nations across the world, but there are still nations that are less developed, and maybe there's something that could be created there if all of their human necessities were met. We won't know that until those human necessities get met, and then all of a sudden I would say, well, does that spoil their ability to potentially create something really radically different if you challenge them with the notion of bonsai? But that's not probably on the radar of somebody hacking it out of the natural environment in Chad. But like when I was in South Africa back in 2015 for the national convention down in Stellenbosch, north of Cape Town, I was really taken back by the fact that every Japanese black pine was styled in a flat top form as if it looked like an acacia.
Mm.
And that's a very developed, South Africa is a very developed nation. And these were sophisticated people, but they were creating what they saw, even though they were impacted by Japanese aesthetics and whatnot, they were not creating Japanese trees. They were creating trees that looked like the native flora around them. And I thought that was freaking
Mm.
radical to see that. It really kind of turned all of my theories on its head of like, oh, even inside of this construct of organization, when left to their own devices without a dogmatic approach, they really sort of handled plant material in the way that they saw plant material existing. And that was like revolutionary for me because it was like, ooh,
Mm.
okay, this goes way deeper than a actual intentional thought and intentional gesture. There's a lot more subconscious manifestation of things in the human mind and through this art form than I'd originally thought existed.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering too, though, that it's interesting. I wonder if though the proximity to Japan, like some countries are much more connected to Japan and the kokofu, and observing those forms, like maybe Spain or Italy, are much more tied into that. Where it's kind of like if you ever went to, or when you go to Japan and they have some sort of English, American phrase that's, if they don't get it fully, they're trying to do it, and
Mm-hmm.
so that sort of disconnect almost, isolates it. That isolation creates this variation because they're not as connected to the sort of motherland as they could be. So I'm wondering too, just they've got Japanese black pines, but this acacia or flat top form might also just be that kind of, well, we thought that's what we're supposed to do, or what I mean, like would they look more Japanese traditional if they were sort of more connected to that? I don't know how connected they are to Japanese. I mean, now with the internet, you obviously can be, but it's almost like finding an isolated tribe somewhere that has no awareness of what the modern world is, and they're doing things very, kind of like in the past. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah, I
yeah,
don't.
totally. And I think you're illustrating the point that like it is always going to be a slightly off version when you're not
Mm-hmm,
immersed in it, not fully comprehensive of it. It's not a part of your DNA. Like I was able to cross that bridge being in Japan, studying under those pressures in that culture, under the expectations of my master and the bonsai community in Japan. I was able to, that was my goal, was to assimilate. And then when I left, I realized, well, that same thing doesn't necessarily cross over. I can do that, but it's always going to be slightly off. And in Europe, the slightly
mm-hmm,
off is the Italian creeps in, the British creeps in, the Spaniard
mm-hmm,
creeps in, right? Like the French creeps in. You can't fin that off in that environment trying to create that thing. It's like, okay, so the Japanese say Makadonardo, right? That's their katakana speaking of McDonald's. And it's like if you heard Makadonardo, you wouldn't know that they're talking about McDonald's, right? It's just a little
mm-hmm,
different. It's being retrofitted to their phonetic language structure. And the same thing if you take, a moyogi tree and you try to execute moyogi informal upright here in the United States, it's always going to be a little different than it would happen in
mm-hmm,
Japan,
mm-hmm,
and so
mm-hmm,
like that's fine. That's okay.
mm-hmm,
But if you're not doing it with the highest level of technique and you're not doing it understanding that it's not going to be quite right, then you can't make it at that highest level that would be
mm-hmm,
perceived as equivalent in quality, technically, aesthetically, maturation, horticulturally, because you miss the point that we can't do it exactly the same. And that's where I just
mm-hmm,
accepted that. I just accepted,
mm-hmm,
okay, I can't do that. So then how do I make sense of this system design wise to not try and duplicate that, but to do it at that level? Or, I aspire to do it higher, whether I'll ever get there or not. The Japanese, turns out they're pretty good at bonsai, right? So, like,
mm-hmm,
I don't know if we'll ever get there. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but I at least want it to be authentic and representative, understanding all of these pitfalls of trying to duplicate something, not being realistic if you're not immersed in the same space that it's being created. You know what I'm saying?
mm-hmm,
And I
mm-hmm.
think, yeah, maybe South Africa didn't have that connection, but even if they did, would they be able to do it as well? If there was a South African apprentice that studied for 6 years with Mr. Kimura and then went back to Stellenbosch or Cape Town and put his hands on all those trees, yeah, for a period of time he probably could, but then he might start gravitating away from that because he's lost, like a dream, it becomes a little bit vague and cloudier the longer time goes on. And he might find himself gravitating, or she might find herself gravitating towards an approach that is different because they're under different constraints and pressures. And this is why I go back to like the urbanization and the cultural pressures changing things inevitably. I just let go of the tether. Like, okay, I can't
Mhm.
do this the same way. I'm not going to try. That's not why I went in the beginning, but I also realized the limitation of it. And so let's do something that is more organic and natural
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
representative. That is, I think, why people create art, not to paint by numbers of Van Gogh necessarily, but to maybe pull on some of Van Gogh's style to find a different way to paint an image that is important to them and expressive of what they're trying to say. And I feel like that's kind of where at least I'm at. But I sense a lot of people in the United States are in that same space where they're trying to figure out all of these moving parts and pinpoint these mechanisms and then decide how they want to handle it. And I think we're talking about an American style, but because the value is on the individual and not on the society as a whole, I think it's going
Mhm.
to be tough to ever like rein in an American bonsai style, you know?
Mhm. Mhm. Or to quantify it as like a singular thing. And I think that's kind of what I've also am seeing, you know, a lot of people struggle to articulate that, especially with their own style. But I do want to go back to your point on conservation, because I think this is something that is, I think is this more distinctly American, is in talking about bonsai as a vehicle for environmental awareness or conservational awareness, and that's not something I heard many people discussing about sort of like the value of bonsai, like what can bonsai add to, or to, you've talked about justifying its existence, because in one hand, we sort of think of Japan as having this kind of spiritual, reverential relationship to nature. But then, one of the things, I was chatting with Peter Warren, and one of the things he saw similar between England and Japan was, aside from them both being island nations, how heavily the civilization has impacted the natural landscape to guide rivers away from population centers, or to, like, it's the threat of nature in Japan is just as extreme, whether it's earthquakes or tsunamis or volcanoes. It's like it's not this like, oh, we're gonna sort of worship nature and all of it. No, we're gonna do a lot to modify the environment so we don't die. And so in America, though, I think what I've heard or not heard is that, using bonsai as this kind of like vehicle for valuation of the natural environment, which America has as like our establishing our national park system as kind of the
Mm-hmm.
first country to really value these untouched sections of wilderness. And so compared to like Mexico, I was speaking to Enrique Castaneda, I believe his last name is, and he's talking about kind of to the developing nation side, is like nature is viewed as a resource, like, because you need to, like, cut these trees down to sell firewood to feed your family. Like, we're not valuing this in that same way, right? And so it's that kind of like economic, nature is a resource, we're going to do that. And like kind of your point of like, does the building of civilization now create the problem that art is responding to? But yet at the same time, like, to go to these developing nations and be like, oh, don't use chemical fertilizers for your crops to feed your populations. They're like, no, 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 no. Like, we want that. Like, you got to do it. Like America did it, Europe did it. Like, don't tell us we can't use these same tools that you use to become prosperous. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so anyway, yeah. What are your thoughts on kind of all of that? One is as bonsai as environmental messaging in the US, and if that's something distinctly American.
Ooh. I don't hear anybody else really talking about that but Mirai and myself, honestly. And that really was born out of the projects in the wild. I think there's a lot of conservation and a lot of conservation effort in North America because Roosevelt did, with the impact of Muir and several other really, I think, enlightened individuals at the time, recognize that our public lands and the national parks, these incredible land masses, can change you on a fundamental, like human, human level, soulful, spiritual level. They can change you. And we need these to remember who we are, where we come from, and to preserve these for generations that can benefit from this identity. Um, and so like we had a great run of, I think, people that had a foresight for the future in our short life as an organized society, United States of America, being a very young country. And I think that that is in jeopardy because right now the United States is not as prosperous, and people are saying we need to capitalize on our natural resources. We need to continue to be a dominant nation. These are the things that we have that other countries don't because they've already, utilized them or put them to work and whatnot. And it's like, yeah, that is the juggling act, and that is the dichotomy of conservation versus capitalism and all of like those complex themes that we talk about. But I don't know anybody who's like, I'm doing bonsai to connect people with a very identifiably human made, or at least human collaborative element, the bonsai tree. Um, to create fascination inside of an urban environment where there's been significant disconnection from the natural environment and our value system around the natural environment. I'm going to use bonsai as a metaphor to connect people to this miniaturized execution of these larger, more ancient trees and the value that comes with having a pet versus, it's like you have a dog and you value your dog, but there's a pack of coyotes and nobody wants the coyotes around, right? They want to kill them, eradicate them. They want them to go away. They're dangerous. We got to get rid of them. And it's like, but this dog is a descendant of, wolves and coyotes, and like they're all part of the same thing. So it's like, I have this bonsai tree, which is my pet tree, but I've got these trees growing outside that are old growth trees or grand champion trees. In Portland, there's been a lot of grand champion trees or historical trees that have been cut down recently because their branches might fall on my roof. I don't like the leaf dander in my gutters and all of those things. And it's like we're just cutting that. But like somehow this bonsai tree in this form has this like, it's my pet dog. I value this, but I don't value that macro or that natural tree as much. But like you can create a value system around that. Like, oh, but is this really that different? And like is like valuing the life of your dog. Like, how do we see the circumstances and how they bridge the gap to like those other fauna that are existing around us as we've expanded into their environment, through the building process and expansion of society. I see that very, very clearly, and I've read a lot of John Muir's writing. I've read a lot of Roosevelt's writing about their mentality and theories of the value of the natural world and how it does help us be our best self. And I've experienced that personally pretty intimately on a lot of occasions to know that I believe it's real. And I also recognize bonsai was like this attempt in the very beginning in Penjing of capturing these profound places and something that allows you to remember what you realized about yourself while you were out there in that rugged environment and the trees that were enduring in that environment. And so somehow through all of this, there is like the ability for people that are of that mind and value system to utilize bonsai in that way. But I don't think in general, a majority of the population practicing bonsai and a majority of the population in general is super concerned with conservation and adjusting their like lived lifestyle to try and be have a lower footprint and leave the world better than they found it. And that's not a criticism, and I don't feel superior in any way saying that. I just think it's like an accepting of the impact that the built environment has on us psychologically, and I think it's an unfortunate outcome. And I think a lot more people would be better off getting out into the woods and suffering a little bit and learning how to enjoy it by accumulating the techniques and the lifestyle that allow them to be more in contact with where we started and sort of where we originated as an organism. But like, that's just me expressing my value system. So I don't think that you can assign that to American bonsai. I haven't seen enough of that to believe that that is a universally accepted approach that could be quantifying of an entire bonsai community's objective.
Yeah. So you don't see bonsai in the US as having an implicit environmental or educational message, even if that's not the artist's intention.
Not at all. I don't see it at all. I've
Yeah.
seen, but I remember like Bob Pressler down at Kimura Bonsai in L.A. did like a really interpretive piece when 9/11 happened. And he created a forest
Hmm.
composition that had like the two most massive trees were dead, and
Hmm.
those were like the Twin Tower.
Hmm.
It was very metaphorical. I thought that was really interesting and compelling that he made a piece like that, and you do see people creating pieces like that. I mean, Nick Lenz would be the real originator of that, with his tanks driving through the forest, knocking down trees, and trees
Hmm.
growing through little toy cars and showing sort of nature reclaiming. And then David Crust with President Hoover, and sort of Dave DeGroote's
Hmm.
critique of that really started bringing these dialogues and narratives that can come from these compositions, and the power that that composition can have, becoming a point of awareness for what's possible and how this art form can serve a greater good beyond a vain aesthetic. And so I really liked that. And those things engaged me because I needed motivation beyond creating a vanity piece of art, with a living organism. I needed it to be more than that, or I couldn't keep doing this. Like that's not enough. Um,
Hmm.
but that's just me, and I think that
Hmm.
there are other people trying to say different things in North America. So maybe
Hmm.
if you wanted to quantify North American bonsai, I think it would be almost like a collage of artist statements would be what
Hmm.
North American bonsai is. And I would say, um, to a large degree, we haven't mastered the art of the collage to a point where our narrative is very clear and identifiable. And I think that's probably where we're at right now, trying to build those skills and techniques to be able to do that.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, kind of on that note, sort of modern and contemporary art here in the US, it sort of often resists these kind of strict categories, so it sort of moves between craft, design, fine art. Do you think that this cultural attitude has affected how bonsai is positioned or understood in the US?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure we quantified the cultural attitude that sort of defines the movement of resisting these boundaries and sort of oscillating between craft and art. I think I tried to make sense of it myself in terms of like, okay, when you see people that are having a game changing impact on society through the art that they're creating, what does their art have? And I really felt like it was a mastery of craft and the technique of it, with a prolific body of work that allowed them to have the fluency to create intentional dialogue and narrative with their work. Like those three elements to me are what change a craft into an art form. And I don't think in bonsai in North America we've necessarily mastered the craft or created a prolific body of work. I mean, that's like what I'm currently trying to do at Mirai, and that's going to be a lifelong process, and who knows where I'll be in the end. But certainly through that, the notion of conservation, the notion of a cultural identity represented in the trees, this understanding of the impact of the built environment, and using my trees to kind of create a narrative and dialogue around what I perceive as a negative impact of the built environment and a loss of touch with the natural environment that makes us our best selves, is a major strand in my work, right? Um,
Mhm.
but I don't know that there are a lot of other people that are necessarily like trying to make that commitment to craft and that prolific body of work that then allows them, or in that process, they learn what exactly their value system is and what's important to them and what they're trying to say through the trees that they create. Will that happen? I think it happens organically when you're committed to a practice and a discipline and an art form, and you want to be the very best that you can be at that. Inevitably, if you like it that much, you're going to make a lot of it. And in making a lot of it, you're going to want it to look better and better and better, which means you develop the techniques and the fluency to do so. And probably through that, life's going to throw you some curveballs, and you're going to come up with, a perspective, whether you realize you're intentionally trying to convey it or whether it's passively coming through the work that you make, which I think a lot of what I perceive in American bonsai is not necessarily super intentional, but still identifiable as a part of the work, because a bonsai tree is one of the ultimate organisms of honesty and self reflection, right? Like it gives to you what you bring to it. And so I think you
Mhm.
see a lot about people when you look at their trees because it's almost an inevitability, just the same as you see a lot about somebody when they're in the native environment, because the native environment's going to give you what you bring to it, and
Mhm.
that can be a dangerous thing. That can be a really high level of exposure for somebody who doesn't want to be exposed.
Hmm. Yeah, so when you do encounter bonsai made in the US, what, if anything, signals its cultural origin to you?
Um, well, I started doing this thing when I worked with kids where I would have them draw a picture of a tree, and I would just say, draw a picture of a tree. I wouldn't draw a picture of a tree. I wouldn't tell them what a tree. I'd just draw a picture of a tree. I was working with a Montessori class when I did this the first time, and every single one of the kids' version of quote unquote tree was a different shape and form. And then I'd say, "Oh, where are you from?" All my parents we just we moved here 2 years ago from Connecticut, from Boston, from New England, from Florida, and the shape of their tree was almost directly representative of where they grew up or where they were born. And I thought that was interesting. And I've talked about the psychological study I read like over a decade ago, where like over 80% of human beings impression of a tree and notion of home is based around a tree, right? And then it's like, okay, if you connect that to the primal mind and we were apes, that tree was important from the moment you were born. That was safety, that was food, that was home, right? So like I have seen that, and I think you see people's point of origin in the United States in the way that they handle a tree. I think you also see the value system of the region that they come from in the way that they create the tree and the way that they present that tree. And I also think in the United States, you are seeing people attempt to say something intentional as they've learned that, oh, the tree not only, but the container, the stand, the accent piece in this construct of exhibition, which is directly derived from Japan and the Kokufu model or the exhibition model in Japan, but these accoutrements mean something. How can I put my meaning into this so that people are able to see me? I think you're seeing a lot more of that now, where when you look at a composition, it's like, oh, okay, I see that Backcountry Dan is from Wyoming by the accent piece that he presented with his ponderosa pine, being a mountain lion, and him having this profound experience of being stalked by a mountain lion collecting that tree. Like, there was a direct narrative there. Or like in the Artisan's Cup, I saw that Troy grew up in the Central Valley around the pomegranate orchards, and had this major impact to his perception of home and childhood and whatnot through these trees. Like, I think you're seeing a lot more of that recognition of the ability to express oneself. I don't know that we've gotten so far as recognizing how the shape and form of the tree and the choices that we make in its design, etc., carry some of that DNA, because that's a lot more subtle and quiet and nuanced how that shows and displays sort of the inner workings of somebody. But I think that we will get there. And I think that it is continuing to happen. And I think in Europe, it simply is incapable of being contained, even if European bonsai practitioners feel like they're doing the Japanese thing. They're still being Italian while they're doing it. They're still being
Mhm.
Spanish while they're doing it. They're still being French while they're doing it. And that is very obvious when you start looking for it.
Mhm. So how do you personally then navigate this sort of balancing between developing this sort of individual artistic language while maintaining some sort of continuity with bonsai as a tradition?
Yeah, I mean, you know what? Honestly, Aaron, I try to not think about it too much. Like, I don't go into a tree being like, how am I going to express myself in this tree? Like, that's the last thing that I think when I'm making a tree. In fact, I don't want bonsai to be so highly thought out that it takes the fun and the organic expression of where I'm at out of the work that I'm doing at that point in time. I go into a tree saying, what is the best that this tree has to offer? Where's its best base? Where's its best line? Where's its best features? How do I take the knowledge that I have of this species and the timeline of its evolution over time in the narrative arc and match it to the point where it would demonstrate its greatest capacity of age with what the material has? how do I continue to make the design more interesting, anthropomorphize it so that it generates a sensation that we can identify with emotionally? Like, does it give me that feeling that I've connected with it when I'm done and I look at it and I can't stop looking at it because it's giving me that feeling? So, it's like finding a song that you listen to over and over and over on repeat because it's making you feel that way. It's like that's what I'm looking for in every tree that I design. And until I get that sensation, I don't stop. I continue to assess it and analyze it and act on it from a perspective of design knowledge and objective knowledge, but really seeking that emotional satisfaction by the time that I'm done with what I've created. Ultimately, I feel like if I'm subservient to the tree and let the tree lead the dance, I'm going to continue to generate shapes and forms and styles that I've never really thought of or that I've never made before. And that is the continual process of exploration for me because I'm doing this to find something out, whether it's find something out about my relationship to the natural environment, which I didn't understand fully until I really committed to the Mirai and the Wild projects, or my relationship to the built environment, which I really didn't understand either, or my feelings of where I fit inside of the cultures that I've existed in the 40 plus years that I've been on planet Earth and how I reconcile those differences. Like bonsai for me is an attempt to try and connect the threads of sometimes unconnectable parts of myself and come to some sort of greater awareness that allows me to be somebody that I like more than I did before I started making that tree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I understand you kind of have a starting point, right? You've got that even goes back to that organizing principles. You need somewhere to start from in order to sort of move out away from that starting point. And so, obviously you do some level of experimentation in bonsai. It's not sort of all maybe you have ideas that you want to try out, or forms or designs that you want to experiment with. And so when does experimentation feel necessary or productive to you, and when does it risk kind of disconnecting bonsai from that kind of home base?
Yeah, experimentation feels productive when I see an opportunity to do something that hasn't been done before in a way that is respectful and representative of the tree that I'm working on. It's like you have a tree that doesn't allow you to conform to anything that's been done to date. Okay, well, now we have to think outside the box to bring the best out of this tree. I do view that as the job of a bonsai professional. You need to take the risks that you have to take to give that tree the biggest voice that it possibly can have. Um, but I think what I've realized is more than experimenting being a danger, accepting a status quo approach has been the most dangerous aspect of bonsai for me. For example, having a tree that offers you unique opportunities and cutting off the uniqueness to domesticate it and get it to fit into a pattern. Now you've just stripped what was special about that tree. You've taken the nature out of it and you've imposed the organization on it. And I had an experience in like the first week I was back from Japan. I had this beautiful literati limber pine that Randy had collected, and I was working in his garage because I didn't have Mirai yet. And I didn't have to do anything to it. In all honesty, it was done. I had to organize the pads a little bit, move a few structural branches, and it was done. And I felt like coming from my apprenticeship, I needed to do something to it. And so I started bending the trunk, and it didn't look good. And I bent it more, and it didn't look good. And I tried to bend it this way, it didn't look good. And then I bent it, and it broke. And then it broke in half, and I kind of pieced it back together and looked at it, and I was like, wow, I didn't need to do anything at all. That was an experience and realization that I'll never lose that lesson because I was so devastated by what I had tried to do to a tree that didn't need me to do it to it. And it was under the pressure of feeling like I needed to impose this aesthetic on the tree, or I needed to get it to fit inside of this criteria in this box, that I actually ended up destroying it. And you see this happen with a lot of trees that look natural, and people say there's too much deadwood and they cut off a 500-year-old piece of deadwood. And it's like, wow, yeah, you really just fuck that tree up. And that was inside of trying to improve it for a shape and form and standard that doesn't even apply here no matter how hard you try. Or taking a tree that's highly mature and not having the understanding of how you handle a highly mature tree, and you don't wire out all the branches anymore, because that maturity, the product of that maturity, is to have to do mechanically less to that tree to get it aesthetically to actualize and present more. And so you see somebody rewire back to an initial styling a tree that had tremendous maturity and needed 10 wires on it, and now it's got 2,000 wires on it, and it's just like, oof, that is really a greater danger to me than experimentation to try and explore and find untouched ground in the bonsai realm, is actually trying to get it back to the most treaded upon and organized and walked on ground that exists.
Yeah. Do you think though that that example, those examples are great, where you saw a tree and felt it didn't need anything, but you felt you needed to do something? Do you think that like, is that a cultural component to where we feel more comfortable taking risks than artists working in more sort of tradition bound cultures? Like, are we more prone to being like, I'm an individual, I'm going to cut the deadwood off, or like, or is that just more lack of understanding? Like, what do you associate those
Yeah,
tendencies to?
I think it's a different value system and a lack of humility. Like, I think in the United
Mm,
States we are, who are you to tell me what to do? This is my tree. I can do what I want. These kinds of things. And it's like, yes, that is true. And that has given us a lot of liberties that have allowed us to develop a lot of cutting edge creative things that have had a major impact on the globe for the good or the bad, or anywhere in the middle, right? Like, so yes, you're correct. That is your tree. You can do whatever you want. Should you do that? Like, is that the best thing to do for that tree? Can we like step back and separate ourselves from our indignity at being told that we shouldn't do that, to recognize that like that isn't the feeling that creates great art. You told me not to do it, so now I'm going to do it, like this defiant little kid trying to establish their autonomy from their parents or something. It's like that's never really bred high level art and creative output. But like, yes, you can do that. And I do think that that is a strong aspect of American culture, is this defiance of being told what to do, this inevitable right to freedom that is so beautiful, and also, if left unchecked, can cause unfortunate setbacks, and it just, in a bonsai model, it can cause the destruction of a tree and its best opportunity, and it's like, well, and somebody would then say, well, you think that's its best opportunity, but this is subjective. And it's like, okay, well, that also, there's a stance there that is kind of the general presentation in bonsai that tries to nullify or silence anything that would suggest that there may be a better way to go about it than somebody is going about it. And you can hang your hat on that. But I don't know that, again, that has ever created the best bonsai. And in fact, I would say it's been the destructor of most bonsai. And so, like, the valuing of maturity and experience and knowledge and ability that I think exists inside of the Japanese bonsai culture is something that has a strand of DNA that connects to the old world European cultures and art forms, is something that hasn't crossed over to the United States, that does lead us to, let's be really honest, create some pretty wild stuff. But we don't have the tools and the techniques to make that created in a way that's as respectable as it could be if we just had a little more humility, a little bit more commitment to the mastery of craft, to execute that thing with a little bit of harnessing of the ego, so that we could have the best of both of those worlds.
mhm. Yeah. How are we doing on time? What time do you have
Yeah,
to
I'm
get out
good.
of here?
I'm good.
Okay. Okay. I got some more questions. So just give me a heads up when you're like, all right, I gotta cut. But yeah. So I think one of the things too that I'm interested in that sort of discussion is, looking forward, then what do you think will define bonsai in the United States for the next generation? Is it going to be refinement? Is it going to be experimentation or ecological awareness, or something else entirely?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really, what will define bonsai for the next generation. Well, I think that we're incredibly fortunate to grow because of our verbal teaching style very rapidly, although I've talked about the limitations of not necessarily being able to achieve the same level of mastery. Maybe that's something that we can continue to work on, but I think that'll be more on an individual by individual basis. I don't know as a community we'll ever achieve the level of mastery that Japanese bonsai has had, because that's a cultural value system there, and we don't have that same value system. But we do have a very ambitious value system in the United States to create something of a very high quality. And so I think that will continue to sort of tag along with other value systems. But I really think that what you're probably going to start to see in North America is a continued manifestation of the art form that is wrestling with and conflicted by the loss of natural resources and the continued movement towards an organized system that is without identity, and has quite a bit of fear, because it's like, I think everybody's nervous when you think about, oh, the economy is doing what it's doing, whether it's good or bad. It's like you can ride those immediate waves up and down, but it's like, where is everything headed with globalization, with technology, with AI, with the loss of potential public lands, with the national park system teetering on the brink of failure, and with the notion that we are at a point where now we need to start extracting our natural resources again. Or I'm not saying we do, but some people believe that we should, and that these areas can be utilized for more financial gain in the immediate future and forego the long term. Like, that's going to create an entirely different reason to do bonsai, a different aspirational system to do bonsai. Here's the other thing: what if we watch the death of Japanese bonsai in our lifetime? Then where does the inspiration come from? Where does the pattern come from? Where does the template for approach come from? And going back to what I started with, we have the profound ability to stand on the shoulders of giants. So what was achieved by Nick Lenz and Walter Paul and Dan Robinson and these other individuals, Chase Rosé, Shanti Bithi, and what they did, these institutions of bonsai, Bill Valvanis, and a lot of these, and a lot of those people are standing on John Naka's shoulders, Von Banting's shoulders, Ben Oki's shoulders, Masi Mizumi's shoulders, Yuji Yoshimura's shoulders, right? And then we're standing on their shoulders. We're standing on Bill Valvanis' shoulders, Dave DeGroot's shoulders, David Easterbrook's shoulders, and so it's like the next generation does get to stand on our shoulders, on Aarin Packard's shoulders, on Ryan Neal's shoulders, on Peter T's shoulders. And I think that's really profound, because our highest level of execution becomes the next generation's baseline for pursuit. But the themes are going to be different that they're wrestling with. And there's only going to be a few individuals that maybe deviate from the consistent approach of the groupthink and sort of what bonsai is, presented as a value system, as a derivative of Japanese culture. And that's fine. That's totally fine. But if you lose that iconic representation of that value system that's formed the foundation of the art, then what do? I really think that that's a realistic thing that we might see and have to look at as we continue to progress.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you're sort of touching on this sense of tension that's existing, and so between your Japanese apprenticeship, bridging that to interpretation of the American landscape, and then Western artistic sort of discourse, where do you feel that greatest cultural tension in your work, and where do you feel the strongest sense of alignment?
I feel the greatest cultural tension in my work is trying to utilize a fledgling art form not largely accepted on a full-scale societal level as a vehicle to elicit positive change in the immediate and for the future. I really feel like bonsai can save the world, and in the modern era of so many voices creating so much noise, and that's not to say noise as a bad thing. There's just a lot of different people with a lot of different goals and ambitions and purposes and altruistic pursuits out there. It's like the tension in my work is, okay, I want to do this in a way that allows it to have a greater purpose. How does that actually get accomplished as there's more and more noise and less visibility of things? And the continued conclusion that I come to is I just have to be my work has to be that good. The things that I create have to be that powerful. The way that I present it has to have that much more thought and execution. And the way that I speak about it has to be that much more elegant and accurate and dialed in. And so, I feel that pressure with anything that I do with Mirai right now, not because I'm trying to elevate Mirai as a brand that sells more stuff. I feel that when I put my hands on a tree and wonder if I am tapping into that landscape's full potential, if I'm creating something that could have the ability to move somebody and conjure up this notion and value system that I hope my work can. And I think about it all the time when people ask me, are you going to do another Artisan's Cup? Are you going to have more exhibitions? Are you going to do something different than you have been doing for the past several years? And I think like I just have a lot of complex feelings around how I do it in a way that actually accomplishes what I'm trying to accomplish, and it's been a little bit paralyzing.
Hmm. And then, I mean, I mean, that makes sense. And then in terms of alignment, I would imagine Mirai in the Wild is probably as close to some sort of aligned practice for you, or is there
Yeah.
something else that you would sense in your sort of that what sort of keeps you going in that regard?
Yeah. So as far as alignment goes, Mariah in the Wild, Mariah in the Wild created this like new value system and awareness and understanding of things that I had not understand previously. It's also created a tremendous amount of tension and anxiety in me because the way that I feel when I'm out there versus the way that I feel when I'm anywhere else is so different and opposing that I want to be out there all the time. I want to make a much bigger shift in life, and that's not realistic. I've got a family. I've got responsibilities, and so I think what I have come to the conclusion of is the same thing that I knew when I started. I just didn't know it to this degree, which is I really have to create an environment in which I can do what I want to do and feel the way that I want to feel, or else I'm not going to be able to divest myself of this tension and this conflict internally. And I think the commitment that I've made recently is just to re up on really continuing to massage and nuance Mirai to being that facility that is the bridge between the Mirai and the Wild projects and the built environment where it's important for me to continue to interact and find some degree of peace in existing so that I have a facility that can foster to the best of its capacity the ability to walk these two worlds well with as little tension between them as possible. And that has never really been how I viewed like Mirai as a facility, an incubator, my home, my studio, my garden. Like I've never looked at it as like a bridge like that. But
Mm.
I have experienced Mirai being completely and totally ruthless to the point of feeling like the natural environment in the carnage it can cause to this thing I'm trying to control, which is the survivability and health of the tree in a containerized environment. And so it has elements of that thing that I value so much, but I'm having to sacrifice the things that I'm trying to protect the most in the process of that. And I've had to some degree come to peace with that as this is what it is.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that I'm sure that tension exists across cultures too when we think about how bonsai is being practiced. Obviously, there's different forces at play, but you've traveled extensively, to other countries to teach, to demonstrate, and I think because you're interested in this subject, I would love to get your kind of shots from the hip about the different countries that were sort of, especially European countries, but Asia as well, that you quickly could kind of like provide a word or some sort of way to encapsulate your understanding of their cultural framework for bonsai. And so yeah, if that's something you feel kind of you'd be willing to do,
Yeah.
kind of just go through maybe the major countries we're talking about, France, England, Germany, Netherlands, just sort of as they come to mind, maybe going through and just kind of articulating some of those observations you've seen about their distinctive cultural characteristics.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I always start with the Italians because they have a big trunk and a small amount of foliage. It's like the ultimate demonstration of machismo. Um, and I really can appreciate that. But there also is this like highly intuitive sense of beauty in antiquity. So this like big trunk, small amount of foliage magnifies the scale and proportion of what can only be perceived as the masculine feature of a tree. And but there it's not just so hedonistic as to be summed up by that, because that value of antiquity is also a big part of that. When I look at Spain, this is all Spain is all about grace and beauty with that same value of antiquity. It's like you have a flamenco dancer merging with the Japanese model to just create this added layer of sophisticated beauty that only the Spanish can make. And I think Spanish bonsai dominates Europe for a very good reason, because it just has that extra something that the other bonsai cultures do not. Right now they're tapping into it and actualizing it. And I think, there have been certain people that have helped that happen. Most definitely bringing the Japanese discipline and technique and rigor to that beautiful artistic expression in the past, decade in Spain. When I look at England, I've always been so impressed with the accuracy, the concise, almost uh, engineered level of their trees, whether it's their deciduous execution of ramification, the work of the ceramicists. Although there is a tremendous amount of artistry in Dan Barton's pots and Derek Aspinall, and Brian Albright, and these individuals, you have almost like a precision in the work that's done in the deciduous trees and the coniferous trees and the ceramics that come from the UK that feels very British to me. And I think when you go to France, you almost have the opposite of that. You almost have like a freedom and maybe even a rejection of that kind of organization and concise precision that is far more stinky cheese and cream based diet and a little bit of BO, but it's beautiful and it's organic and it's honest. You get to Germany, and I think Germany is really has a similar kind of conciseness, but not in the execution of the aesthetics so much as in the execution of the practice. It's like you go see the Austrian and German bonsai execution. The gardens are dialed in and organized. The trees are dialed in and organized. Are they necessarily as artistic as the Spanish trees? No. Are they as acutely detailed as the British trees? No. Are they as masculine as the Italian trees? No. But the organization of the entire system, the lifestyle of bonsai, the garden environment, the tree and container, the presentation is very, very well done on a sort of like holistic level. And I think that's where you see the German kind of Austrian, and I don't want to offend anybody by combining the two, but I see nuances of both of those things in the same thing. And like if you look at Horst Heinzelreiter, you're talking about the pinnacle of artistry, but like Horst is dialed in. Like his packing job when he ships pots, I've never seen anybody pack with such precision. His garden is detailed out to the nth degree. That kind of mixture of that mentality with that historical reference to art is really interesting in the German expression. And there's probably some other ones in there. I don't necessarily have as much of a beat on like the Swiss approach.
Like Netherlands, like anywhere like where
Sure.
Bonsai Focus is based, the Dutch or
Yeah, the Dutch and the
um
Belgians, although the Belgians and the Dutch and even the Belgians from the Flemish to the other portion of Belgium are going to be quite different.
Hmm.
Yeah, when I look at the Dutch, do I have anything that I can say about the Dutch? I guess I don't. I don't have anything I can say
Hmm.
about the Dutch, but I would like to comment on Japan, which
Hmm.
is,
Yeah, Asia as well, China,
yeah, I would
Korea,
like,
Taiwan, any of those. Hmm.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as far as Japanese bonsai is concerned, um, I read something that the florist that's doing a lot of Azuma Makoto. I read something that, or no, I watched something that he made. It was a video that was on YouTube or one of his channels. This is like maybe 10 years ago. This is when he first started like freezing trees and submerging them in water tanks and stuff like that. And he was saying something to the degree of nature by itself is beautiful, but nature with the hand of man creates something beyond nature. And I saw a sign that Taiga Urushibata had put, whether it's at Taisho in his garden or whether it went with like his explanation of work at some sort of exhibition that he did outside of the bonsai realm. He had a similar artist statement that nature alone is beautiful, but nature plus man creates something more beautiful than nature. And I really feel like that summed up Japanese bonsai and maybe the mentality that there is something beyond the beauty of nature that is accomplished by human beings improving nature. I, I, because we live on a landmass that has a lot of untouched nature, I don't necessarily agree with that. But if you lived in a population density that exists in Japan where nature has largely been manipulated, then maybe that could be your impression of it, right? And the value system that's created around it. But I think that that kind of artist statement is definitely very capable of explaining the traditional model of bonsai and its evolution over time, right? That mentality. When I look at China, I always had a very profound respect for the history in China, knowing that in the 12th century they were on the verge of the same industrial revolution that we accomplished in the 19th and 20th century, um, and that Genghis Khan really curbed a major shift in how the globe would have matured had Genghis and Kublai not come along. So there's this like level of long standing sophistication. There's a lot of color. And there's also a combination of some degree of potential roughness, rough edges, right? A crudeness to the culture that shows a little bit of aggression and shows some of these pricklier parts of the culture that I think manifest in the more abstract and slightly grotesque aspects that you see in Penjing. And it's interesting when you start going into the wild that there may be more of a crossover between Penjing forms and wild forms than there are bonsai forms and wild forms. And I've really been drawn to Penjing, having spent a lot of time in the wild trying to mimic the things that I'm seeing in the wild, because I see Penjing potentially having a closer strand of DNA to what I'm doing than actually bonsai. And so I value that cultural system and the wrestling in China of the old with the modern, which I think you see in their society in general. When I look at Indonesia and some of what's been being done with the Pemphis and whatnot, I think you're seeing um, a manifestation of Penjing that is still tethered to the original concept, but you see the rhythm and I think a high level of joy and freedom and looseness in the Penjing model that plays on scale and proportion maybe better than any other current iteration of miniaturized trees. I think that the Pemphis branching and pad formation that has come out of that realm of Asia has completely rewrote the way that current bonsai standards perceive branch movement and shape and form. And I can only assume that that is a testament to some degree of freedom and joy that occurs in the culture there. Um, Taiwan seems to just be this absolute commitment to mastery on a massive scale, which is crazy because you've got these tremendous size trees, power, interest, dynamic, high level of technique that's time related, but is modernizing and showing artistic abstraction in the plant form that nobody else is accomplishing. And it's all being done how they're grown, but how they're handled after being grown. And it's interesting that the scale and size of their miniaturized tree art form is happening inside of a country that is incredibly small. The land mass is incredibly small and constrained. Um, what that means, I have no idea, but that scale and the contorted beauty of Taiwanese bonsai almost feels reflective of a tremendous amount of conflict that is being experienced in terms of identity on a larger like social global scale. In if I tried to figure out where that came from, but it's undeniably amazing, and I actually think Taiwanese bonsai elicits a strong response from people that see it, but I don't think that they identify that that might be the product of a tremendous amount of internal conflict or societal conflict, where you have all these cultures merging inside of this autonomous culture, trying to maintain their autonomy, but being informed and influenced and more or less, pushed around and bullied by a global powerhouse. So it's like, oh, okay, that's a lot to unpack in that. When you look at that tree, it's like, whew, that has an impact. Whether it's like, oh my gosh, that looks cooler than another tree. It's like, yes, well, the basis of good art is a high degree of internal conflict to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Who else?
Korea. Any thoughts on South Korea?
I don't have enough contact with South Korean bonsai to be able to speak to it. I did read a fact that South Korea is a country. So Japan and South Korea are both ready to experience significant population decline. Um, on like a like 30, 40, 50. I've even read reports of like a 60% population decline by 2050, depending on what the factors and all of those things mean. Um, and the rigor of society that creates either the economic standards that are unrealizable while rearing kids, or the standards that create the kind of rigidity that build the kind of discipline to produce what Korea produces as such a small country, has to translate into their bonsai. It has to translate into their bonsai, I would believe. I also read a factor that Korea had the highest suicide rate, or among the highest suicide rates in developed nations, and was closely followed by Japan. And that kind of like pressure cooker society conformity, dedication to precision. I know that a lot of Japanese architecture is derived from Korean architecture. A lot of Japanese crafts are derived from Korean crafts. So some of what we respect out of Japan is a direct derivative of Korea, and I would think that you would also be able to see that in their bonsai pursuit, but I don't have enough contact to be able to actually say that's true.
Yeah. What about, and I know it's hard again to focus on Western, Europe and the US and Asia, but any thoughts on South America? The Brazil, for example, has the highest Japanese diaspora outside of Japan. Any other sort of Central American or South American countries come to mind, or anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I was working with some people that were making bonsai ceramics out of concrete down in Mexico for a minute, just kind of like
Mm-hmm.
starting to look at their work. And I did a podcast on it. Like, I saw an undeniable opportunity for bonsai in Mexico to have such a colorful, vibrant expression of the merging of culture and nature. And I would still really like to see that flourish and like take off. But yeah, Mexican culture is so colorful and so alive. and so built out of, I think, appreciation and joy, that I think there's so much that they could contribute. And I think Enrique Castaño is, the top of the heap in terms of Mexican bonsai and what he's making. Whether or not he's pursuing or exploring those cultural threads or not matters little to me. It's up to him what he explores. But I think there's a lot of ground there to explore and to creatively potentially tease apart in the bonsai practice. Um, my exposure to Brazil is a lot of bonsai artists that feel like they are closely following the Japanese standard, which makes sense because it is such a significantly impacted region, with Japanese immigration and a high level of Japanese Brazilian people practicing bonsai there. So there's a lot of tradition that got passed down to Brazil. But beyond that, I don't really have anything specific I could speak to because I've never been there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful. So yeah, I think kind of with this kind of final, I guess, well, and then America, I guess, yeah, we're putting a pretty broad brush, but if you had to do the same sort of interpretation for the US, what would you
Yeah.
like summarize that for us?
Unapologetic commitment to uh, a singular artist statement. Unapologetic commitment to the freedom to do and say and express what an individual wants to do and say and express through the work that they create. I think that is iconically American, for the good or the bad.
So, kind of in closing here, so if someone 50 years from now looks back at the early 21st century America, bonsai that we're doing today, and that might be kind of your explanation, but yeah, what do you hope they would understand about the culture that is shaping bonsai today?
What do I hope? I mean, that's my own value system, separate from what I would hope they would see, across North America. So let me just divide that into two questions. What I would love for somebody to say about North America is that North America embraced their tremendous privilege of freedom to explore all of the outer boundaries of what was possible in bonsai, and that some of the most unique shapes and forms and expression of the miniaturized tree were realized in that incredible opportunity of having an unrestricted ability to create allowed. For myself, I would hope that people would look at my work in the future and say, "Damn, that dude was bold and brave and pioneering in his ability to give a voice to the incredibly unique and diverse native environment that is continental North America."
Mm-hmm. That sounds like a great goal, a great hope, and
Hopefully,
yeah,
hopefully.
hopefully that is the story that is written. Um, any final thoughts for you? Anything you wanted to add, or any thoughts that we didn't cover that you wanted to include in this conversation?
I mean, obviously, I hope anybody listening or taking in your exhibition, I'm sure you'll handle all of this subject matter, with a tremendous amount of integrity and diplomatic restraint. But like, I never want to mischaracterize the cultures that I experience or the values or anything that I talk about when we start to discuss this subject matter, because I recognize in not being part of that culture, there are things you can get wrong or misinterpret, etc. This is just strictly kind of like a mile high view looking down on these bonsai cultures and coming up with quick, consistent strands of DNA that I see expressed through the trees that they create, and hopefully capitalizing on the strongest attributes of those cultures to make something unique and representative through the form of the tree. So I just want to say I hope I haven't offended anybody or said anything wrong, but I mean, I think that every single culture has something tremendous to add to the form of this art, and I really, really hope that people take advantage of that opportunity that they uniquely possess, because I think in trying to follow a model that is not uniquely ours, it gives us a great template and a place to always come back to in the process of experimentation. But you're only going to be able to do what you individually and culturally are capable of doing at the highest level by leaning into what your capacity and unique perspective is. And I would love to see it on every single practitioner's opportunity to present that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a great point. I think that's part of the motivation of this exhibition is to not is to present it as a very limited view on this, right? It's the biggest challenge people have had when I've been interviewing them is trying to feel like they're speaking for their entire
Mm-hmm.
culture. They don't feel fit to do that or want to sort of even within the U.S. We're not a homogenous culture.
Totally.
From the
Yeah.
southeast to the northeast. So there's even regional variations, just like dialect, right? It's all English, but everyone's accents just different enough, and so it's hard to reduce these ideas to sort of uh, quasi stereotypes. But it's also at least a dipping the toe in the water to see what unique things there are that exist. Because it's such a small sample size, right? I mean, we don't have thousands of bonsai professionals in all of these countries to kind of draw on. There's maybe 10 or 15 maybe in a country that are able to do bonsai professionally. So yeah, and people who are sort of thinking about these things and doing it at this high of a level, right? You don't have the numbers to sort of draw upon a sample size that's large enough to make some sort of really nuanced distinctions. And so yeah, my goal in this exhibition is to highlight the title of the exhibition is Bonsai United, playing off the sort of soccer club names. Typically United is in a lot of soccer teams' names, and so while it's also speaks to this broader unification that we have, right? It's all this shared practice. It's the shared love of bonsai, the shared love of trees, and the value they bring to our lives in whatever capacity, right? And people are engaging with bonsai for a lot of different reasons, but it's also kind of across culture. Uh, those reasons are kind of the same, whether it's for social interaction in clubs or just the care of horticulture and tending plants or some sort of deeper artistic kind of voice. Um, those are pretty cross culturally shared, and so we want to highlight that kind of that unification, that unity we have in this practice, but while also celebrating those unique ways that art and culture kind of influence each other and to create something that's distinct at the same time. So yeah, there's been no, you know, we can't include every country in the world. What this is just my effort to try to start that conversation and to get a sense of some of these more significant countries that have a pretty well established bonsai tradition and community that we all sort of recognize as being at least having enough to sort of look at and try to tease some of these ideas out.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really appreciate you speaking on this. And the exhibition will be opening in May of 2026 and running through 26 and 27. So it'll be up for a few years. So hopefully, if people are in town for the World Cup or whenever, whatever might bring them to the Pacific Northwest, to come by and see this, because I think we'll do our best to try to synthesize this and at least help the visitors who might know nothing about bonsai realize that it's a global practice and that there's opportunities for wherever you're from to find a way to engage with it, and so hopefully encourage that appreciation in a deeper way.
Yeah, very cool, man. Very cool. Well, I wish you the best of luck on the exhibition, and let me know what I can do to help.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks so much, Ryan.
All right.